before I hand over to the main proceedings, it would be remiss of me not to mention Dr. Paul Caskey. Paul is the head of AFBI's Economics research team of about 22 researchers, and he joined AFBI in January 2020, so just before COVID. So Paul and I haven't actually met very much face to face. Paul really does build on the work of Professor Davis, and he has made a great impact on the economics team over the past 2 years. I'm delighted that he has brought this conference today together, and I'll wait till the end of the conference to congratulate him and the team. But for now, thank you very much, Paul, for all your hard work and efforts to plan, coordinate, and really bring this conference to life today, which I am, and I know a lot of people are really looking forward to. So with no further delay, folks, can I introduce Dr. Norman Fulton, DAERA's Deputy Secretary, to chair this first session this morning. Thank you, Norman.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to this first session of the day, entitled Environmental Sustainability, Policy Challenges and Opportunities. I'm Norman Fulton. I'm Head of Food and Farming Group within the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, and I'll be chairing this session this morning, which will take us up to about 11 o'clock. So we have three excellent speakers lined up for you for the session. So first of all, we'll have Professor Michael Wallace, Chair in Agriculture and Food Economics at University College Dublin. Michael will be addressing the opportunities and challenges of increasing environmental ambition in agricultural policy. Then we'll have Dr. Adewale Adenouga, Senior Research Economist at the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute, and he'll be considering the interplay between environmental and economic efficiency on Irish dairy farms. And finally, then we'll hear from Dr. Alastair Greig, also a Senior Research Economist at AFBI. And Alastair will be looking at the potential impacts of lower red meat and dairy consumption in GB on the Northern Ireland agri-food industry and our wider economy. So I'll introduce each of our speakers properly before their individual presentations. And at the end of each presentation, we will have a few minutes to take questions from the online audience. So I'd ask you to submit your questions using the Q&A function on WebEx, and I'll pose those questions on your behalf to the speakers. So please do keep the questions flowing in during the presentations. So now I'll turn to our first speaker, Michael Wallace. Michael is Professor of Agriculture, Food Economics and Head of Agribusiness and Rural Development Section at University College Dublin. Michael was brought up on a dairy farm in County Monaghan and obtained his BSc and PhD in Agricultural Economics from Queen's University and an MSc in Economics from University of Warwick. So no stranger to Belfast. Michael has previously held academic positions at Queen's and Newcastle universities. His research interests focus on the economic analysis of agricultural and environmental policies and their impacts on farm households and rural communities. He also conducts analytical modelling to evaluate farm-level innovations and technical adaptations on the sustainability of agricultural systems. Michael serves on several advisory boards, including Ireland's CAP Consultative Committee and the Welsh Government's Sustainable Farming Scheme Analysis Group. So Michael really is ideally placed to discuss the opportunities and challenges of increasing environmental ambition in agricultural policy. Michael, I invite you to the stage.
So good morning, everyone. I first of all want to thank Elizabeth for her kind introduction to the conference, and also my appreciation to Norman, who's chairing the session. And I want to also give a special word of thank you to Paul Caskey for inviting me to speak at the conference today. It's a real privilege for me. So I want to talk about this area of increasing environmental ambition, which has become a key theme in the development of agricultural policy, both within the UK and in the EU. And what I hope to do in this talk is first of all maybe explore briefly some of the sustainability challenges, speak for a moment about the policy agendas, and then look at some of the issues or areas where I feel social scientists or economists can contribute to helping to find solutions that address some of these opportunities and challenges. So really to set the scene, I want to begin really by thinking a bit about the sustainability challenges. And often when people speak about sustainability, the focus tends to be very much on the environmental dimension. I think that's for fairly obvious reasons because of, for example, media coverage, which in some cases is quite negative with respect to agriculture, and in some cases quite inaccurate. But there's also the sort of pressing urgency that is arising from legally binding commitments that governments have entered into, not least of all in relation to climate change and also ammonia emissions, to name a few. One point I really want to get across here is that it's important that we don't look at environmental sustainability in isolation, and it's vital that we have a broader understanding of sustainability in its context, consisting of the three elements which I have on this slide in the diagram. So environmental sustainability, economic, as well as social sustainability are intertwined with one another. And failures in relation to one of these components will often have negative impacts on the other. So if I think about the economic side for a moment, having viable farm incomes is an important enabler for farmers to be able to take higher level environmental actions. So it's necessary. And similarly on the social side, if we think about areas like farmers and farm families' workloads and the increasing intensity of work that farmers and farm families face, that can often crowd out their opportunities to be involved in higher level actions. So we need to think about this in the round and appreciate the three dimensions of sustainability acting together. We also need to consider the broader policy context and constraints, and clearly those things relate to the competition for exchequer funding, and I suppose most obviously in relation to things like health at the present time, and of course the high level of costs associated at least with some of the interventions that are necessary to deliver the required environmental outcomes. And the last point that I have here on the slide relates to the idea of the just transition, which is often a term that's referred quite extensively to in some of the debate, particularly on climate change. And for farming and for rural economies, this is very important because I think that the agricultural sector and rural areas more generally are likely to be disproportionately impacted by some of the climate policy measures. And that needs to be recognized as part of the wider debate. Thinking maybe a little bit more about some of the environmental indicators and what's really been happening there. Unfortunately, it's not altogether a positive picture. And I think if we think about greenhouse gas emissions, for example, from agriculture, and I'm showing here the trend both for Northern Ireland and for the Republic of Ireland going back to 1990. So this is an index with 1990 equal to 100. And I think what's fairly clear is that we haven't really made any progress in actually reducing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions in aggregate. And meanwhile, very ambitious targets have been set both by the UK government, by the government in the Republic of Ireland, to dramatically reduce emissions. And there will be a clear expectation that agriculture will deliver as part of that. I just show a star here, which is the Irish government's target, which is now enshrined in legislation, that the agricultural sector will be expected to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by in excess of 22% by 2030. So we're facing really a mountain to climb here, going from the current trajectory to now having to look at very significant reductions in emissions and getting farmers to engage in mitigation options that are going to be required to take us there. The ammonia situation, quite similar. And up here, the star on the right-hand side of the screen shows the UK target, which is a 16% reduction in ammonia emissions by 2030 relative to the 2005 level. So very significant challenges lie here in actually being able to deliver these huge targets. And meanwhile, other areas like water quality and biodiversity, I don't have time really to dwell too much on them, but they're also pressing concerns that affect agriculture, obviously. So I think it's true to say that agriculture is facing a step change. It has a key role to play, obviously, in some of these environmental problems, but I think I would also emphasize that it has a critical role to play in the solutions. As a land management activity, it's unique in its ability to allow carbon to be sequestered in soils through hedgerows and agroforestry. So there are real options there for agriculture to deliver the necessary or work towards delivering some of these huge national targets. But it will require unprecedented adaptation. And I'm not sure whether we all have, and whether the farming community has fully appreciated just the extent of what's being expected of them, the breadth and scope of changes that will be necessary in terms of farm management. Meanwhile, facing considerable uncertainties about future technological innovations that might help us towards reaching these targets. And also critically, what sorts of land use changes may arise. And certainly the UK Committee on Climate Change has indicated very ambitious targets about land currently used for agriculture switching to other uses, such as for habitats and for obviously agroforestry for sequestering carbon. So quite significant issues there. And meanwhile, we're seeing the dilution of income support policy to farmers as more money is clearly directed towards environmental programs. It's needless to say, it's been a very intensive period of policy development, not least of all in the UK post-Brexit. And in the case of Northern Ireland, we've seen environmental and food policies culminating obviously in a framework for the future agricultural policy in Northern Ireland. And I think announcements, Norman has mentioned, are probably going to be forthcoming on that very soon. And in parallel, similar efforts ongoing in other parts of the United Kingdom with parallel policy development processes. And similarly in the EU, very extensive work has been ongoing, not least of all around steps towards reaching climate neutrality through the Green Deal and its commitments for farming through the farm to fork strategy. And then that's feeding in turn to the new CAP, which is due to commence in 2023, which will have a much greener focus. So what we're seeing consistently through these developments is a strong environmental set of priorities for obvious reasons. In the Republic of Ireland, similarly, clear environmental and food strategies, and these are feeding into the national CAP strategic plan, which sets out Ireland's policy commitments and interventions under the CAP post-2023. Huge amounts of effort have gone into developing that strategy, and key part of that are new eco schemes and agri-environmental and climate measures, which will absorb around about 30% of the overall CAP budget. So I think what we can conclude is that there are common threads across both the UK and the EU approaches around particularly these overarching environmental and food strategies. Key themes or key words like resilience and sustainability appear repeatedly in the documentation, but there are obviously differences around the sort of policy weighting between prioritizing environmental goals versus the other dimensions of sustainability. And I think probably the DEFRA position has probably been most strident towards the environment, particularly around public money for public goods, a mantra that's often repeated in that context. But we're seeing a much more strategic approach, which I think is a good thing, with clearer priorities. And I think that has been a really positive development, as well as greater levels of engagement with stakeholders through the sort of co-design process, which we're seeing both in the UK and also in the EU around developing future policy interventions. So I think there will be a much greater focus also around monitoring of performance and outcomes, so much greater focus on a strategic approach with monitoring of outcomes from policy interventions and their degree of success. The opportunities are also very clear in this, that there can be a very powerful benefits that can be achieved to the agricultural sector through greater recognition of environment as part of the overall policy programme, not least of all in terms of legitimacy of support and providing greater public acceptance of support payments to agriculture, as well as what economists refer to as addressing market failures, particularly around the provision of public goods. So there's a strong economic logic, and as I've said already, the strategic approach should provide better targeting of interventions and may also develop some of the sustainability credentials of products which may have advantages in certain market contexts, particularly as required by product supply chains. And we could also see greater monetization of public goods from land management with new income streams for farmers, particularly around things like the carbon farming agenda, and I'm hoping that we might hear some more about that in talks later in the day. So important strengths that should be clearly recognized as part of this. But I want to then maybe delve a little bit more into this idea of the dimensions of agri-environmental policy ambition and what do we mean by it. And I think there's really two key dimensions here that we can think about. On the horizontal axis of the screen here, you can see the participation rate of farmers and the percentage of farmers that will be engaged in particular environmental actions. And then on the vertical axis, we can think about the depth of engagement. So on the horizontal, the sort of breadth, and on the vertical, the depth of action and the level of environmental outputs that are likely to be generated. And we can think about the kind of levels then that are currently visible in policy and that are continuing to be strengthened and extended in the current policy debates, relation to things like the minimum standards or regulations that will apply, those, of course, are compulsory across all farms, that farms have to comply with them, or probably more regularly known as the cross-compliance conditions. And we're seeing strengthening of those, tightening those, making them more onerous, I think, on farmers, particularly in areas like dealing with nitrates, phosphates, and space for nature as well, which has now been strengthened in the EU proposals, as well as protection of wetlands. So there are new standards that are taking place that are applied across farmers. We can then think about the sort of next level, which is a sort of broader environmental programs or actions that farmers will take to promote environmental outputs beyond what is compulsory. So we're now thinking about the voluntary side. And this can relate to things like the KT programs, which promote improved management practices that benefit the environment clearly, but also broad programs like of the proposed English scheme for the sustainable farming incentive, which will apply across a wide range of farms, or the Irish eco scheme that's now coming in under Pillar 1 of the CAP, which will hopefully appeal to a wide range of farmers by providing a menu of options that farmers can participate in, and farmers under that scheme will be required to complete 2 measures to qualify for a payment of around €70 per hectare. And then we can think about the higher level again, going up in tiers towards more bespoke environmental programs. So like the environmental farming scheme in Northern Ireland, we tend to think of these as sort of Pillar 2 of the CAP programs, agri-environmental schemes. So we're likely to see some further strengthening of those, broadening them across more farms, and more ambition in terms of the level of delivery, particularly around the cooperative and landscape dimensions at the very top. So in the English environmental farming, environmental land management, we're seeing the kind of highest level landscape recovery with very ambitious plans around things like restoration of wetlands and investments in forestry. What I think is important to recognize here, of course, is that there is a cost to that, a policy cost. And as we move towards higher levels or depth of action, the administrative cost of policy clearly increases, as well as the cost to farmers as well of those actions. And that obviously constrains the potential participation because of budget allocations and limits obviously the maximum payment per participant. So there are core trade-offs that we have to grapple with when designing policy reflecting the budget realities in this context. So the policy interventions that we can think about have been certainly in the English and Welsh context been subject to a lot of investigation through these policy intervention logic chains. And these are a way of communicating evidence of how the social benefits of policy can be incentivized and ultimately delivered. And you can think about the kind of here as an example of maybe a policy logic chain for something like decarbonization, where our targeted public good, let's say looking at towards the right-hand side of the chart, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and then working back through the chain, thinking about what management actions are required to deliver that. So in the yellow box on the bottom left, then how those management actions then will feed through into a farming system and interact with management along with the biological and physical processes to deliver that targeted environmental good, in this case greenhouse gas emissions reductions and possibly other environmental benefits as well. And what they're really looking for here is the strength of correlation between particular actions and the resulting environmental goods that they were seeking to incentivize. What happens here, of course, is that there are obviously implications for farm productivity. In some cases, it may be win-win in the sense that a measure of implemented to protect the environment may also enhance farm productivity, as may occur in something like nutrient efficiency. And that will obviously have a benefit. Others will have a negative effect on productivity, and there will be obviously resulting impacts on costs and revenues. So what we're seeing then on the right-hand side is how that then becomes valued in terms of the components that generate value for society. In this case, marginal abatement of greenhouse gas emissions will have a social value, and arguably we could put a value on that. And indeed, the Treasury has a value for carbon, which they could essentially apply to that, quantify that social value. And then the bottom side, which is the sort of private or market values, which are obviously to do with the change in revenues and costs. And those are the usual way that environmental payments are organized at the moment through revenue foregone and costs incurred. So what the DEFRA work has shown particularly is that the incentives through that simple revenue foregone, cost incurred model are not very great, and that they need to be strengthened if we're going to have greater level of engagement in environmental action. So the argument is that there should be some greater recognition of those social values as part of this. These are complex issues that we're getting into because you have to think also about the overlaps and trade-offs between different management actions and their effectiveness. And how that is dealt with, and of course the role of external factors which may impact on the degree of success in delivering these environmental outputs. So a lot of work really in trying to provide the logic around interventions. Clearly we're still focused around management actions. Ideally we'd be focused on the output side and paying for that directly, but administratively that is highly problematic to deal with. So in most cases, it is still a focus on management actions, proving that they can deliver the desired outcomes. So there are clear dilemmas, though, for current agri-environmental schemes, and one of those relates to the standard payment rates and heterogeneity that exists in farm costs. So that obviously creates a risk that in some cases farmers may be overcompensated based on that sort of standard payment if they can perform that environmental action more cheaply than the standard payment rate. But more often than not, it's insufficient incentive that's arising. And certainly that applies to in the case of farms that maybe are on the more intensive end of the spectrum, who will often find these types of schemes less attractive. And there's also the kind of menu-driven approach where farmers pick the least cost measures to implement often that may not necessarily generate the maximum environmental benefit. So these factors mean that there's a somewhat limited extent with a relatively low engagement by more intensive farmers and highest uptake often in areas with lowest environmental pressures. And that's something that we do need to address. I think within the Irish eco scheme, they're looking at ways of bringing in incentives and actions that will appeal more to those more intensive farmers that might include progressive nutrient application rates that basically incentivize farmers at those higher levels of intensity to at least reduce their use of nitrogen, for example, back to recommended levels. So there's quite a high degree of complexity really here that has to be dealt with around things like the additionality with some of the measures, how it interacts with support payments, and of course the point that I mentioned about paying for actions rather than paying for outcomes. And that's always a conundrum that we face, but administratively very challenging to reconcile. So I just want to move on then to think a bit more about the sort of data and measurement aspect, because I think this is absolutely critical to what we need going forward. We desperately need to establish strong policy baselines and have performance metrics that will be monitored. If we're not measuring things, it's not likely that we're going to be able to manage them effectively. And I think the actions that Northern Ireland and DAERA has taken particularly have been really positive in this regard, and focusing on how they develop policy baselines. For example, the soil survey and LiDAR mapping, which is proposed, I think are really, really positive in establishing that baseline position, and would be vital if we're to move in the direction of, for example, carbon farming and give farmers a recognition, for example, for biomass that's in hedgerows and agroforestry. And also linking to the sustainability benchmarking at farm level. We need to be able to internalize targets better so that they can relate to farmers and their action plans more effectively, so that we get a greater buy-in from farmers who are, if they're to deliver more on these desired environmental sustainability outcomes. And of course, areas like the scientific base for management actions, it goes back to that logic chain and establishing the evidence that supports particular management actions and their strong correlation with the desired environmental outcomes that we're seeking. And of course, the issue of valuation, which I think will be a subject for other talks later in the day, so I'm going to leave that one. I then want to sort of move on to think more generally about the issue of behavioral change and how that may relate to some of the issues that I've been speaking about here on environmental ambition. I think what we do recognize is that to have any chance of reaching the desired targets, that will depend crucially on farmers' adoption of particular management measures, whether it's in terms of participation in specific environmental schemes or voluntary actions to mitigate environmental impacts on farms without necessarily getting paid for those. The difficulty I suppose we have is we have a lot of technical solutions provided by scientists, but of course they then encounter the human factor, and that's where things often go off course. So there are lots of complex social science issues relating to the farm and farmer-specific factors, management skills, attitudes, how people perceive the norms in society and how they're influenced by their peer group to undertake particular actions, and how that interfaces with our knowledge transfer systems, our advisory services, and how those can better facilitate change on farms, something I'll come back to in a second. So I think what we really need is strong predictive models that will better allow us to understand those technology adoption processes, particularly around rates of adoption and obviously the reaching peak levels of adoption across the population. And that can include an array of particular measures or techniques that we use in economics. What complicates this, though, is the diversity and complexity of actions required. And if you think about just the mitigation measures that we see, for example, in the so-called marginal abatement cost curve that's used particularly for carbon emissions and ammonia, you know, the extensive array of management actions here around animal and feed, around things like soils and fertilization, whole set around how we manage slurry and manures on farms, and of course around things like land use such as agroforestry and habitats, and of course renewable energy. Not have time to look at these, but what I'm doing here is just to show the just the depth and range of things that are being expected of farmers, and the risks here of information overload that can arise, particularly when we think about the processes on farms that need to be done to actually decide on particular actions to implement, that level of farm level evaluation that must go on, the farmer's planning horizon, how they evaluate the risks and ease of implementation, and other considerations that will be vital to the success or otherwise the farmers actually taking up these mitigation measures. Remember that if farmers don't take up these mitigation measures in significant numbers and don't pursue them, we just will not have the chance of actually getting anywhere near the types of targets that have been set. So this is a massive issue in practice. And from an economic point of view, we can think about the tools that we have available to us to do that around things like models of the diffusion process and trying to understand what the drivers are of uptakes of actions by a population. And I think one of the things that the Rogers framework that I have here shows is that there's a risk you can get measures that will be picked up by early adopters, the innovators and early adopters. And sometimes we get this chasm that means that we don't get the greater levels of uptake through the broader population, which will be absolutely essential to reach the types of targets. So from the perspective of knowledge transfer, what we're really looking at is how do we go about speeding up degrees of adoption of our key measures, remembering we're hitting close to 2030, so there has to be a lot of action taken quickly, and how do we hit high levels of adoption within the population? That sort of cumulative adoption rate needs to be high if we're going to stand a decent chance of success. And what we know from the evidence there is that often these processes are quite slow, and that there is often a delay around getting people to take up these measures, and we're often looking at often a decade or more to get significant adoption rates in key technologies. I think one of the useful frameworks out there is the ADOPT model by Kuhn et al. 2017. They, I think, develop a very nice framework that can be used by agriculture researchers and indeed policymakers and others that are planning extension efforts to help understand the key levers that we can use to help formulate and promote the technology adoption process. And they identify really two overarching factors: how farmers learn about an innovation and how they perceive the relative advantage of that. And the learning process influences the speed of adoption, and the relative advantage, they would argue, influences the peak adoption rate. So they bring in a lot of the various social science evidence about drivers of innovation around things like the farmer-specific influences on their ability to learn about an innovation. That's often around advisory contact as well as existing knowledge and skills. Characteristics of the innovation itself, like its observability and ease of implementation. And then on the kind of relative advantage side, what is the sort of goals and objectives of the farmer, and the degree of environmental orientation versus profit orientation will be a key factor that will determine their likelihood or otherwise of adopting particular environmental measures. And then lastly, the relative advantage of the innovation itself, its cost benefit type analysis, its assessment of risk and the sort of time horizon involved with that in innovation. So it's a complex mix of factors, but what they provide is a very useful framework comprising 22 questions that one would go through, 22 variables, and then using those to provide quantitative assessments about the likely rate of adoption for specific measures and the likely peak adoption rate. So quite a nice framework. The knowledge transfer aspect of this obviously is critical, as we saw on that previous slide, and that's all about really the advisory capacity, how we harness opinion leaders and demonstration farms, and there's really strong work ongoing like the ARC Zero initiative, which I think is a good illustration of what can be achieved out there. There are limitations, I think, to some of the approaches that we're using, like participatory or discussion group approaches, which may not always work well given the diversity and complexity of some of the management options. And really, they require farmers to be proactively seeking information on these things, which might not always be the case in the set of priorities. So I think we also need this linear model with direct one-to-one advice to farmers around actions, particularly based around a benchmarking exercise of the business sustainability. And that needs to be supported with continuing professional development and training. And I think I'm really delighted to see that as a key factor that's built into the policy framework that's forthcoming in Northern Ireland. And also, how do we engage with unreached segments of the population? Really difficult challenge in practice. And I think with some of the Irish evidence shows that about 58% of farmers have minimal or no contact with advisory services. So how do we reach some of these segments? Older farmers, younger farmers that are too busy because of off-farm jobs and so forth. And these need new models of actually engaging with them. The last things that I want to just finish off on my presentation, because I'm realizing I'm going a little bit over time here, I just want to finish by a couple of brief comments around the sort of modeling side. As economists, we often provide a lot of input around development of models that hopefully can help inform decisions, particularly around policy. And I think the case for strong whole farm systems models for evaluating mitigation measures is very to the forefront, at least in my mind, being able to evaluate different strategies, the trade-offs between them, and obviously the interactions between farming system and various abatement technologies that might be implemented. And I'm pleased to say I'm working on a project currently with an AFBI-based PhD student, Kelso Aiken, who's working specifically in this particular area. And that can also extend to other things like how we model regulatory changes and incentive measures, and building resilience, which is also another key platform to climate variability. Just have one quick illustration as we sort of come to a conclusion here. You know, looking at resilience, I just have here an illustration from the UCD Lions Research Farm where we had a drought event in 2018, which I show here, the red line. You can see that dip in the grass growth curve. And that happened just as we're reaching a sort of peak lactation of a spring calving herd. And what I was doing here is modeling that impact on the system. So running the current level of management and seeing, well, what does that do to the financial performance? And without delving into these figures in any depth, the bottom line here is that it about halved the net margin, the farm profit, just that one event. And it shows what we're dealing with around climate variability and their potential financial impacts. The challenge for us is what types of management strategies will help us address those things. And then the sort of last point here is around modeling at the sectoral level, which is also important. And AFBI has very strong track record, particularly with the FAPRI program in this area. And I think that is really key here going forward, being able to assess the longer term impacts of policy and indeed market drivers that may arise. But also I think we need to look at areas where, you know, land use change, farm structure change may take place. And I think some of the work that's ongoing, particularly in Wales in this area, through their environmental and rural affairs modelling unit, I think is, or program, is particularly a good illustration of types of work that's really needed there to look at the types of changes that are taking place. And also understanding the broader impacts of the economy, both upstream and downstream, as well as the primary sector impacts on output, income and employment, particularly if we're looking at this just transition that I mentioned at the outset. My very last slide, because I'm out of time here, just want to acknowledge that really these binding environmental targets impose high stakes for farmers and other individuals with an interest in the agri-food industry. And that means we're going to have proactive management responses, otherwise more costly impositions could be on the horizon, such as livestock reductions. So it will require some reorientation of approach, as I've noted here. Also point out that sustainability is really about individual choices. So recognizing that farmers face a lot of other pressures, and sometimes these environmental challenges may be more abstract and longer term and may not be the most pressing consideration just at the moment. And that gives rise to certain problems about urgency of action. So as researchers, we need to be able to provide solutions and help with that adaptation process. And lastly, I just have a point here about the opportunities for some realignment that may take place. That is another positive that could arise from current efforts along this trajectory. Not least of all, potentially rebalancing power within supply chains. And I think we're already seeing that to some extent for another reason in the post-COVID world as commodity prices have strengthened a good deal. But I'm going to leave it there as I'm out of time. I'm actually going over time. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michael, for that. That's an excellent presentation. And really, I think you've highlighted very well the policy tensions and trade-offs that we do have to consider going forward for developing our future farm policy. Maybe just starting to, I mean, you mentioned on the way through the breadth and complexity of measures. I mean, are we at risk of asking too much of farmers, trying to deal with all these different things, deliver multiple outcomes, and really leave our farmers behind on this journey?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a real concern that I would share. I just, as a researcher, there's a lot of interest in some of these mitigation options. I sometimes feel overwhelmed myself, and I sort of think myself, I put myself in the position of the farmer dealing with all of this information and trying to digest it and decide on appropriate measures to implement within their own business. I think there is a very severe risk of overload. And I think this goes back to the sort of challenge that we face, particularly in our advisory or knowledge transfer systems, and how they provide clear, consistent, and relatively simple messages for farmers. I think one of the issues that came up in that kind of model that I showed is being able to demonstrate particular options and for farmers to be able to observe them and see the ease with which some of them can be implemented. Now, not all of them can be implemented easily, and that's the other issue. So I think these are things that we have to address, but they're particularly knowledge transfer challenges in the main, and how we provide information to farmers and work with them to make the necessary management changes.
And maybe we should just sort of be developing on from that. And when it comes to environmental programs, probably in the past we've relied quite a lot on rules and prescriptions. Do we now really need to move into that of providing farmers with the skills and knowledge to actually deliver outcomes rather than follow rules?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Norman. And I think the need for training and continuing professional development, I think, is really, really key here. And I think it relates to the previous point as well about the sort of complexity here, navigating that complexity. So we can help to facilitate that by providing people or helping them to develop greater skills in being able to come to terms with some of these challenges. And in fact, within the Republic of Ireland's environmental schemes are actually building in that type of training component as well, because I think it's now recognised this is essential. We have to do that if people are going to stand a reasonable chance of being able to implement measures successfully. So I think that's important.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And really sort of developing on, we do need to try and drive that greater uptake of environmental programs. And you mentioned the challenges of trying to entice intensive farmers to engage in those types of programs. So do we need to really think now about making agri-environment a compulsory element going forward, or do we stick with the voluntary approach?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of both really happening there. I think the regulatory side is already starting to impact very hard on more intensive farmers. I think most evident around nitrates regulations, and particularly the requirements, as I'm familiar with in the Republic, around nutrient management plans and use of low emission slurry spreading, undertaking particular training as well. There are a whole plethora of requirements there. So those regulations are pretty key, I suppose, pushing that agenda more rapidly. But obviously, I appreciate that farmers often are not too keen on that because it's costly for them as well. So I think there's a role for both. The voluntary side, I think, has its place, and just thinking about the likes of the CAP Eco scheme I mentioned about the sort of the more intensive farmers, giving them options that they can participate in an eco scheme. And I think one of the good initiatives that come up in the Irish proposals is to have a progressive system where you have rates that may apply, so that farmers that are up in that more intensive could be given a payment by just simply reducing back to recommended rates or slightly below recommended rates. So there's ways of kind of graduating it rather than saying you have to go for a low input option, which that's just not going to go for, you know. So that is a way we can get there with a voluntary type program with an incentive to make improvements that could make a real difference.
Yeah, and I suppose we are to be successful in changing farm practices. You know, we need to consider the drivers in here. And you mentioned this in your talk about potentially the issues around the cost incurred and income forgone model. Do we really need to push beyond that now and look at really providing incentives based on the value or the worth of the environmental outcomes that are being produced? And does that create then difficulty in terms of WTO obligations?
Yeah, I think certainly it looks like looking at some of the DEFRA work on this, they seem to be suggesting that payments should go beyond just the simple revenue forgone cost incurred model to incentivize and I suppose provide farmers with an actual income element to this as well. So I think there's a sort of a dual motivation there ongoing. I agree with you around the sort of WTO commitments because clearly that is an issue. But looking, I suppose, at the UK's overall support ceilings, it's probably not going to be a major issue given the amounts of money that we're talking about here. So I don't think they're probably going to run into a massive issue with WTO, even if they are to provide a scheme that goes beyond that sort of standard revenue forgone cost incurred payment model.
Okay, maybe just final question then. So really this is about behavioral change. And do you think, is this an area where we really need more sophisticated social science research to understand really what drives farmer behaviors and how we can best actually influence that and change what they're doing? Is this an area of research that really, I suppose, has been neglected up to this point?
I think it is. I think that behavioral science is absolutely critical as we face into some of these challenges. And I think equipping advisors with those skill sets, understanding drivers of behavior and innovation. And in fact, at UCD, we have a master's program, Master's in Agriculture Innovation Support, which is focused around training the next generation of farm advisors and filling that gap because there's a real capacity issue there. And a key part of that program is really around these behavioral theories and understanding what those drivers are and being able to interact with farmers and what sort of communication strategies work best and in different situations. So I think it's some of that is something that we need to consider also to be able to raise our standards, particularly on that sort of behavioral science to be able to interact with these issues more effectively.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much, Michael. And super presentation this morning. Really thought-provoking, so thank you for that.
Okay, so our second speaker this morning is Dr. Adewale Adenouga, a senior research economist at the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute. His current research focuses on long-term land leasing and on measuring the economic and environmental impact of business development groups, which is one of our more important policy interventions. So Adewale will present on the interplay of environmental and economic efficiency of dairy farms on the island of Ireland. And just to remind you folks, keep your questions coming in. Adewale.
Thank you, Norma, for that introduction. I am Adewale Adenouga, and I'll be presenting on the interplay of environmental and economic efficiency of dairy farms on the island of Ireland. The first thing is, within this title, you have two words. One is environmental efficiency, and the other is economic efficiency. To some, these two words are contrasting, and to the others, you expect them to complement each other. But the biggest question we want to answer in this presentation is it really possible for us to be environmentally efficient and at the same time economically efficient? To the farmer, normally the goal is to be economically efficient, to increase income, to increase profit. But to the society, we care about the environment. And the farmer, in trying to increase profit, makes use of different set of inputs. And part of this input is nitrogen and phosphorus. So He applies in feed, he applies it on grass to increase productivity. But in doing so, inadvertently also have impact on the environment because the farmer is producing two things. One is the fact that he is producing the milk as a dairy farmer, which to him, that's what concerns him. But it's also produced the undesirable output in nitrogen and phosphorus surplus. And these have two important consequences. One is that any application of nitrogen and phosphorus in excess of the immediate animal of grass need is going to affect the cost output ratio of the farmer, which the farmer cares about. But the farmer, most of the time, do not care about the fact that the excess nitrogen and phosphorus from this also have effect on the environment. And in this study focuses on the island of Ireland, which is Northern Ireland, and then the regions of the Republic of Ireland. Within these regions, nitrogen and phosphorus surplus has become a source of environmental concern in dairy production. And agriculture generally accounts for about 30% of the incidence of water pollution. And currently, recent data also shows that about 50% of lake water in Northern Ireland are classified as poor or bad. In fact, based on 2020 data, only one lake body is classified as good or better. And in the Republic of Ireland as well, some 269 waterways have been considered deteriorated in quality between 2015 and 2017. So you ask, why am I saying this? The question is, it is believed that majority of this problem results from nitrogen and phosphorus surpluses, and mostly from dairy farms. So the question then is, if the goal of the farmer is to maximize profit, is it possible to at the same time be efficient environmentally while trying to maximize profit? That is the question we try to answer in this study. And where is the best place to study this? It's definitely the island of Ireland, because you have a system where there is different, to some extent, environmental, like different production and policy environment, especially during the quota era. So you have a Northern Ireland system that depends more or moderately on the use of concentrate. And you have the low input system in the Republic of Ireland, which is mainly grass-based. So how is it possible for these systems to affect the environmental and economic efficiency of these farms? Looking at this diagram just to give you a simple picture of what we are talking about. The farmer makes use of nitrogen and phosphorus in forms of fertilizers, and this also in form of feed produces manure which goes into the soil, and then this goes out in form of marketed crops and further crops. But most of the time, you still have this excess within soils that can go into the waterways and then cause a detrimental environmental impact. So it therefore means that it is essential that we apply the appropriate and optimum input to make sure we don't have this problem on the environment. So this study was conducted on the island of Ireland. What we did was to divide Ireland into 4 regions so we can get a homogeneous set of farms as much as possible. So Northern Ireland, which of course is part of the UK, and then you have the Border Midland, the Western region, the Southwest, and the Southeast region in Ireland. So we considered 2 undesirable outputs, which we could call externalities that accompany dairy production system. In this case, we considered nitrogen and phosphorus surplus. We looked at if previous studies would have just considered efficiency of dairy farms without incorporating these undesirable outputs in nitrogen and phosphorus surplus. So in this study, we said it was essential to also look at if we incorporate this undesirable output into estimating efficiency, will the farm still be efficient? So, as I said earlier, the study was conducted across the 4 regions of the island of Ireland, and this table shows that the relative difference across this region in terms of their dairy production systems. You have Northern Ireland, where you have relatively larger farm size in terms of land area, in terms of livestock units. You also have this stocking density, relatively the same. But one important difference is the fact that the average dairy cow in Northern Ireland produces more milk per cow compared to the average dairy cow on the island of Ireland, even across all 4 regions. But at the same time, you also have the regions of the Republic of Ireland making use of more like low input system. So there are higher level of forage grazing in the dairy production system in the Republic of Ireland compared to Northern Ireland. So the question is this likely going to have any effect in terms of their nitrogen and phosphorus surplus? Then we try to check that. So what we did initially, without incorporating the profit margin or income, we just decided to measure the nitrogen and phosphorus surplus across these regions. So what we found is that nitrogen, like phosphorus surplus per hectare in Northern Ireland was higher compared to the regions of the Republic of Ireland. This also consequently means that just considering these environmental variables, those farms in the Republic of Ireland were relatively more efficient in terms of phosphorus use efficiency. But we ask ourselves what could be the cause of this. One thing we know is that during the quota era, you have in Northern Ireland where quota wasn't a constraint. So farmers were able to purchase quota for quota was a system where there's a limit to the amount of milk that can be produced within an EU country. So, but it wasn't a constraint in Northern Ireland, but it was a constraint in the Republic of Ireland. So farms in Northern Ireland were able to use more concentrate to increase yield. But this also have its own detrimental effect because it also means producing more nitrogen and phosphorus to the environment, which of course affects water quality. The story is the same for nitrogen as well. You have higher nitrogen surplus in dairy farms in Northern Ireland compared to the dairy farms in the Republic of Ireland. So that initiative we considered just nitrogen and phosphorus surplus, and then we found what we got, that we have higher nitrogen. But then we now incorporated the nitrogen and phosphorus surplus and also considering the gross output in terms of the profit of the farm. So, and we got to know that it is possible for farms in these regions to increase their milk production and at the same time reduce their nitrogen and phosphorus surplus. Because what this means is that an average farm in, for example, Northern Ireland could increase milk output by 9% and simultaneously reduce nitrogen and phosphorus surplus by 9%. But we should not attempt to make comparison between this region based on this result because the model that we used is a relative term. So in a layman term, what this means is that if you consider maybe southeast of Ireland, for example, 4% efficient, it means that compared to the best farm in the southwest region, you have this group of farms. And then within this group of farms, you have the farm who is very good and you have a farm who is not very good. So the comparison is done only within this region. So relative to the best farm within a particular region, the average farm in that region can still increase milk output by 4% and simultaneously reduce nitrogen and phosphorus surplus by 4%. So that is what that means. So that is a good news because it means that, contrary to general opinion, it is possible for farms to be environmentally efficient and at the same time to be economically efficient. So the average efficiency here is 93%, 96%, but we should not attempt to compare this because it actually depends on the farms within a particular region. So we also went further to look at, yes, now we know that it is possible for farms to be environmentally and economically efficient at the same time. What are the factors that could influence farmers? What do we need to do? What are the policy variables we need to work on? So we observed that farmers that with more forage output per hectare are likely to have higher environmental efficiency. And of course, land area as well. Farmers who have access to more land are more likely to be efficient. And in addition, farmers who take accurate record keeping of their production output, which of course could have effect on the way they manage their resources, are also more likely to be environmentally efficient compared to farmers who do not take records. So we conclude that, first of all, potential exists across the regions of the island of Ireland to increase milk production and simultaneously reduce negative environmental impact. So, but one important thing we also got to know from this research is that there is a positive relationship between technical and environmental efficiency, which means that to be environmentally efficient, the goal is to be technically efficient. When you're technically efficient, when you make good use of your inputs, your feeds, everything, you are most likely going to be environmentally efficient as well. So what do we need to do? What we need to do, and as Michael has said in his presentation, is that there are, of course, a lot of scientific solutions to this problem on how we can reduce the environmental pollution in our society. But we have to see, how do we get farmers to adopt these practices? How do we get farmers to make use of these scientific solutions? If we are able to do that, so when farmers adopt best management practices, which of course is a win-win situation, because by making better use of resources, you reduce costs and become more profitable. And at the same time, you are actually being better off in terms of your environmental performance. So emphasis should be laid, for example, on reducing concentrate inefficiencies. So what this means is that concentrate, for example, contributes to the nitrogen and phosphorus surplus. So when there are efforts to reduce concentrate inefficiencies, and we get farmers to adopt these practices, we're most likely to have a better production systems. And then, of course, enhancement of farmers' skills. Again, as Michael said in his presentation, farmers have to be trained. Farmers have to keep good records. When farmers put this into use, in terms of that management, we can always get to this goal of like being profitable and at the same time not destroying our environment. So this study was funded by Chagos and AFBI under the WASH Fellowship Program. I want to acknowledge also the Department of Agriculture, Environment, and Rural Affairs for providing access to data. I want to also acknowledge my co-authors, Professor John Davis, Professor George Hutchison, Trevor Donnellan, and Mike Spartan, and of course, my line manager, Claire Jack, for taking her time to go through these slides. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Adewale. Just a few questions within the time that we have available to us. So in terms of what your research is really telling you here, you can drive better environmental efficiency in concert with better economic efficiency. So do you believe we can get to a model of production in Northern Ireland where it is sustainable in terms of the N&P surpluses that are actually causing these negative externalities?
Yes, yes, I do think so. Like, for example, our result has shown that you could increase meat output and simultaneously reduce nitrogen surplus. But of course, I have to be sincere that it's also possible that you get to a stage really where further increase in output could mean that you have to produce this undesirable output. But at the moment, and based on current input and current production system, if we try to make better use of our inputs, for example, in terms of the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen in feeds, if we can increase the efficiency of that and making sure we're giving the animals exactly what they need without putting too much into it, I believe definitely we can be environmentally efficient in terms of natural resources.
And I think one of your slides really sort of pointed to more production from grass. So it's higher yield of grass and a greater use of a grazing platform actually will help drive that sustainable model.
Yeah.
Okay. And maybe just a final question. So you considered nitrogen and phosphorus. What about other production externalities such as greenhouse gases? So what can you really say about that?
Yeah. I think that when the study was conducted, our focus then was just on nitrogen and phosphorus surplus. But going forward in the course of the study, we also realized that it would be good if we include other environmental variables like greenhouse gas emissions. So it's something that would probably do in the future to see the extent to which that can affect the result if we incorporate that as well. Yes, but I understand it's something we should consider in the future. Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, thanks very much, Adewale, and thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll now move on to our third speaker for this session, Dr. Alastair Greig. So like Adewale, he's also a senior research economist at the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute. His particular research interest is macroeconomic modeling and specializing in computable general equilibrium models and input-output modeling. His current projects also include modeling the impact of Brexit on the Northern Ireland economy, so that's no small task. And Alastair will present on the impacts of lower GB consumption of red meat and dairy on Northern Ireland agri-food sectors and the wider economy. So, Alastair.
Thanks, Norman. Thanks, well, everyone who's here, and it's a shame I can't see more people. So yeah, I'm talking today about the impacts of lower UK consumption, but GB is really what we're interested in, and the impact that's going to have on Northern Irish agriculture. So the NI agriculture is extremely livestock orientated. So the agri-food system it's uncharacteristic even of Northern Europe. There's maybe Ireland and Wales are quite similar to it, but it has a lot of cows and a lot of animals. So clearly any change in demand for meats or dairy products will really, it would be important for Northern Ireland to keep abreast of what's going on. Yeah, an important point here is that the food manufacturing sector is pivotal in the agri-food system. So when you talk about exports, or at least the assumptions we make in our team is that if you talk about exports, you're talking about food manufacturing exports. So this is anything that happens to a cow or after it's killed or slaughtered, and anything that happens to milk after it's once it begins to be processed. So food processors are exposed to these changing demands, and its impacts how these cascade down through the economy. it's true that NI agriculture is dominated by beef and dairy, but it's also true that NI food manufacturing is dominated by beef and lamb processors and dairy processors. So yeah, the specific challenges for agriculture, but most of these again will apply to the food processors. So there's a reliance on subsidies, which is uniquely for agriculture. There's dependence on commodity sales to GB for the food manufacturing, and there's they're emission intensive and difficult to address. It's emission intensive, and it's very difficult to address that without fundamentally changing the agricultural sector. So the Climate Change Committee, which Michael talked about in the plenary talk, essentially argues that there should be a big reduction, or a reduction in beef and dairy and lamb, and Northern Ireland in particular should essentially move away from agriculture. At least that's their land use strategy. They do have a role for beef and dairy, but it has to be much leaner and more efficient, emission efficient. It should be said as well, though, that the CCC recommendation shouldn't be really any surprise, since sustainable development has been a big issue in economics so at least since I did my PhD 10 years ago, and it existed way before that, going to the 90s and even in the 80s. There was calls in Ireland especially to reduce reliance on beef in particular. So the way we look at the way we're looking at these changes the CCC are proposing is we use an input-output model, and I won't bore people with the details of that, but it's needless to say that it tries to take in the whole economy. It's a set of accounts looking at all the inputs and outputs from each sector in the economy. So we in AFBI produce a agri-food disaggregated. So we want to get the different types of food manufacturing, so if you're producing beef or dairy, and we make what we think are corrections to the NISRA accounts, so the official accounts. We then use that in a model that can generate the results. The important point here is that a lot of the results will be determined by the assumptions we make in the data, or the assumptions NISRA make in their data. But so the results I'm about to present are illustrative. They're sensitive to changes in the data, and also it assumes there's no policy response from DERA when they encounter something like this. So a 20% reduction in UK demand is quite severe for the food manufacturing, at least for beef and dairy, and then the animal feeds as well. So that the animal feeds is your indirect effects from your supply chain. But needless to say that you're looking at big falls in output if there's a big reduction in UK demand, and there's no demand to catch. There's no changes. There's no industrial response. And then, so looking at the food manufacturing, that then cascades down into agriculture, where you get all the industries that feed into the food manufacturing sectors. They then take a hit. Again, the important point here is the role of subsidy agri-support could cushion the fall to a certain extent for the agricultural sectors. But again, these are just illustrative results. But so the change in employment tends to hit agriculture harder than food manufacturing for some reason, but we're seeing, again, very big falls. This is about half of the total employment decline across Northern Ireland from this reduction is in the agricultural sector. So less so in food manufacturing. This is probably due to the productivity that we assume in the beef and dairy sector, beef and dairy manufacturing. Okay, and the saving grace, of course, is the fall in emissions. So you get big falls in emissions from the big two, the cattle and dairy, or dairy farming. So yeah, I mean, do reduce, if there is a big reduction in beef and dairy, you get a more emission efficient agricultural sector at the end of it. It's then what sort of remedial responses you then put in to soften the blow. So if realised, the fall in GB demand presents a lot of challenges to NI beef, lamb and dairy sectors, for the food manufacturing and agricultural sector. Interesting, we do further analysis and we find that dairy is much more resilient than beef. This is due to much of a lesser dependence on the GB market. And this actually is true in our Brexit modelling as well, that dairy tends to be more resilient than beef. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of remedial responses that could be done. You could attempt to get a bigger share of the GB market. So GB consumers are consuming less beef, but they're still consuming beef. You're just trying to make sure they consume NI beef. You could try and find alternative markets. The lower emissions would then be up to, well, I suppose Dara trying to lead to say what's the alternative. So I think the CCC will imply they would like to see tourism being promoted instead of agri-food. Although we've done some analysis to suggest that the vegetables or crops, if it's possible, could counteract the worst of these effects at some slight cost to labour efficiency. Okay, thank you for your attention, and if there's any questions, send them to Norman.
So thanks very much for that, Alastair. So a few questions here. So first of all, I think you have maybe alluded to it, UK demand is significantly serviced by imports from non-UK suppliers. So is there an argument that imports could bear more of the consequence of reduced consumption rather than the domestic production sector? In other words, there will be a degree of domestic preference by consumers?
Yeah, yes, though what we found in the Brexit modelling is a big challenge is the domestic beef in GB, so Wales and Scotland, who I think Scotland in particular exports a lot of beef. So you may get trade diversion effects. The models we built in AFBI do kind of look at these kind of scenarios, but I would say that there's as many challenges as there are opportunities, I would have thought.
Okay, and again, you did mention this on the way through. The red meat sector in particular would be quite exposed because it is very much dependent on the GB market, and I think that's largely been a consequence of the BSE crisis back in the 1990s, and really the focus of that industry on servicing GB. So really, does this now point to the UK, or sorry, to the Northern Ireland agri-food sector really needing to look to markets beyond GB and start to diversify its portfolio of markets?
Of course, it's always good to find new export markets. I mean, part of the reason why the GB is a destination, of course, is because their diets are quite similar to NI, so they eat a lot of beef. So, they eat a lot of things that NI produce. So, yeah, I mean, of course, it would be beneficial there would be benefits from trying to find alternative destinations for exports. How easy that is, I don't know. How easy it is to sell beef, I don't know, to abroad.
Okay, and the UK, of course, is now starting to make its own international trade agreements, and I suppose the pattern that's emerging is one of quite an open trading environment. So effectively, the UK will be a more open market with supplies coming in from other parts of the world. Have you had a chance yet to reflect that into your modelling? Is that likely to be a further challenge for the industry?
You could argue that the work here is essentially a prelude to that work. So our model, the CG models that we're using are multi-regional. So they're particularly designed for these types of trade scenarios. So new deals that come in and so forth. I can't really think of any specific deal. I mean, there's Australian wheat that came up a few months ago, but right now, because the NI protocol has not been fully enacted, there's still a fair bit of uncertainty. So, it's fine to talk about new trade deals, but I suppose we need to get a kind of solution to the protocol sooner than later. Yeah.
So in terms of then of taking this through then ultimately, I suppose, to land use within Northern Ireland, I mean, do you actually see this then driving a significant change in land use within Northern Ireland if there's a significant step down in the red meat sector in particular?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if there's I think it goes without saying, if there's a big reduction in the red meat sector, there's going to be quite fundamental change to the NI agricultural sector. What that means in terms of how agri-support is structured or what it is that people are doing in the rural areas, it's impossible to say, right? It's possible for me to say, but we do have scenarios that we plan. So I think we're kind of interested in tourism, and this work kind of looked at if they shifted to other more environmentally friendly agri products. But there's, we're also looking at tourism. I think where these policies tend to go. At least where Scotland went with their policy.
So there's a lot of big, I suppose, global shifts happening, and you've looked here really today at the consequences of reduced consumption, really being driven by the climate change agenda. And I know that AFBI is currently modelling Brexit scenarios. So can you say anything about how these results might compare with what those models are telling you, and what other influences are likely to be facing the sector here in Northern Ireland over the next number of years that it will have to adjust to?
So we can compare these to Brexit, and for red meat, I would say that the sustainability side probably presents a bigger challenge, because I don't think that's going to go away, and the protocol could resolve itself. However, there's also the kind of cumulative problems. So you have both at the same time happening. So you have to then respond to these challenges as they come up. But I would say that it's more the cumulative problem. If you have Brexit happening while we're reducing red meat consumption, it presents a lot less avenues for manoeuvrability, policy, and all the rest.
Okay, Alastair, I think that probably runs down the clock for us. So thanks very much for your presentation and for taking those questions this morning. Thanks very much, Alastair.
Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our first session this morning. So I think we really have had three excellent presentations, and the speakers have given us much to think about. I think the years ahead will be certainly not lacking in challenge for policymakers and for the industry alike. So I really want to, on behalf of everyone who has signed into the seminar this morning, to thank our speakers and show appreciation for that. So we're now going to have a break in proceedings, reconvene for 11:30 and resume with the second session of the day, which is capitalising on environment, valuing and monetising. So another great session to come. So do tune in for that one. So thanks very much, everyone.